يتعلموا دينهم وأن يتفقهوا في دينه. كل واحد من الرجال والنساء عليه يتفقه في دينه، عليه يتعلم ما لا يسعه جهله، هذا واجب، لأنك مخلوق لعبادة الله، ولا طريق إلى معرفة هذه العبادة ولا سبيل إليها إلا بالله ثم بالتعلم والتفقه في الدين. الواجب على المكلفين جميعا أن يتفقهوا في الدين وأن يتعلموا ما لا يسعهم جهله، كيف يصلون، كيف يصومون، كيف يزكون، كيف يحجون، كيف يأمرون بالمعروف وينهون عن المنكر، كيف يعلمون أولادهم، كيف يتعاونون مع أهليهم، كيف يدعون ما حرم الله عليهم، يتعلمون. يقول النبي الكريم عليه الصلاة والسلام: من يريد الله به خيرا يفقهه في الدين.
بالعلم بل بالأدب تنال أعلى الرتب، فعش حياة العلماء وقرأ صنوف الكتب.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وأصلي وأسلم على المبعوث رحمة للعالمين، صلوات ربي وسلامه وبركاته عليه. أما بعد, so obviously this is the second track and with its own stream, inshallah. We finished the first track and this is another topic. Now, again, when I was contemplating what to talk about in terms of the topics, and Allah Azza wa Jal, yani, if I may say, inspired me to think that we just finished Sirat al-Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, which obviously yani, is from the topic of history, right? It has some historical perspective, because we're talking about certain events or the events of the life of the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam, and then we talked about the lessons learned from that. Now, obviously, Sirat al-Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and then the lessons that we learned from it went all the way to what event? Maut al-Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, up to the death of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, or the passing away of the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam. I thought it would be appropriate to continue with history and talk about the events of Khilafah Rashidah, which in total is a duration of about 30 years altogether. And then some events beyond that of what happened during the Khilafah of Muawiyah radiyallahu an, Amir al-Mu'mineen, and beyond that up until the event of the unjust killing of Al-Husayn ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib radiyallahu an al-Jami'. And the reason for the choice is twofold. The reason for the choice of this topic is twofold. For one, obviously this is something that is a history of our nation, history of this ummah. And studying the history always is beneficial because there is a lot to learn from. And at the same time, I think it is shame on us if we don't know our history. How can an ummah be if it doesn't know its history? Right? Shame on us. I mean, we know a lot of things. We know a lot of details. How can it be that we don't know the Khilafah, for example, or some of the events of the Khilafah of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, the best of this nation after the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam? Or some of the events that happened during the Khilafah of Umar or Uthman or Ali, and what happened? This is one. And there's a lot of benefits that we can learn from it. The history of the nation is something that is so precious, and especially that this is the golden era. This is a golden era. Obviously, the best time of this ummah was during the time of the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam. But right after that comes what? obviously the time of Khilafah Rashidah that the Prophet ﷺ praised. And he alayhi salatu wasalam, in many ahadith, he praised those first three generations. The generation of the Sahaba, radwanullahi alayhim ajma'een, and the generation of at-tabi'een, those who came after them, and the generation of tabi' at-tabi'een, who came after them. So these are the best of the generations. And again, there's a lot to learn and benefit from that it would be a loss if we don't have a good knowledge of this era. The second one is that there is a lot of inaccuracies out there about this time frame. There are a lot of people or sects or authors who have written about this duration or this time period, and intentionally or unintentionally they distorted a lot of the events excuse me, and they included a lot of falsehoods and lies for various reasons, and we're going to talk about some of that. So it was very important to really study and learn about the events and the history of this time frame with authentic information coming from authentic sources, masadr al-sahiha, because studying history is not an easy matter. Studying history is not an easy matter, especially if the person is interested in learning the truth, in learning the authentic version of the series of events. A lot of people got into it and wrote, and some of them, they had different backgrounds and they had different goals and purposes, right? And they wrote from the aspect and the perspective that serves their agenda, if you wish. We, Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah, we are always interested and keen about the truth, al-haq. We don't accept anything except al-haq. And like we do with respect to hadith al-Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah from the very beginning, right? They, when lying upon the Prophet ﷺ and fabricating on the tongue of the Prophet ﷺ started, they realized that there was a need to protect and to authenticate, and we had to have a tool by which we can distinguish this is hadith sahih, this is hadith hasan, this is hadith da'if, weak. This is even mawdu', fabricated. Somebody fabricated it and attributed it to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Unless we have a tool to be able to tell and filter the falsehoods out and keep only the haqq, then this religion would have ended up like the previous religions, Christianity and Judaism. There would have been no difference. What kept and protected this deen is that there was scholars of hadith who studied the man and the narrators, and they came up with a whole science of ilm al-hadith, and important and amazing. Even the other nations and even those those who studied the deen of Islam, they are amazed. They tell you that there is no science that is more accurate than ilm al-hadith. And obviously this is what by which the deen of Islam was saved from changing and from being distorted. We have a tool, walillah alhamd, to be able to tell what the level of the hadith, what we can accept, what we can rely upon and build upon, and what we reject and we say this is fabricated, hadith mawdu'. And when it was obviously that these generations were the best of the generations, right? So it was virtuous for us to actually study their stories and their events. And also it was a duty upon us to defend them from the lies and from the fabrications that were made up against them, because this is from their rights upon us. We were just talking in the previous session or in the previous track that the greatest favor that the Sahaba and the Tabi'een and Tabi'at-Tabi'een did to us is that they preserved this deen for us, this knowledge. Remember when we talked that one generation passed it along to the next generation from al-amathil, from the best of those who had a high aspiration, right? They passed it along from one generation to the other until it reached us. طيب, this was because of them. Had they not done that, we wouldn't have this knowledge now. So their rights upon us is to actually defend them and to look into, those stories and those events and see which is accurate and which is truthful or truth and which is falsehood. And because Allah Azza wa Jal has manifested this religion, أعز الله, this deen by them. They sacrificed everything, their wealth and their life, for the sake of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala and for the sake of spreading this deen. And yet, we don't believe that anyone is ma'soom. We talk about the virtues of the Sahaba, but we don't have anyone who is infallible other than the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam. When we say that, we defend them and we talk about the virtues of Ashab al-Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that doesn't mean that we claim al-isma to anyone. On the contrary, the individual Sahabi may err, may have mistakes, but all of them together, they won't agree or they won't they won't agree upon falsehood. If they agree upon something, it has to be al-haq. طيب. One of the things also that we're going to achieve in this book, or in this rather track, or by studying this period of history, is also we're going to take a look at how we are supposed to study history. What is the methodology of studying history? Because there are a lot of people who actually go about it in the wrong way. They go about it in the wrong way, and they think that they are looking into the right books, or they think that they are able to read the books of history, and they're able to understand those events. And we're going to talk about a little bit of that. And then also, we're going to talk about the events, the historical events that happened during the Khilafah of Abu Bakr, and the Khilafah of Umar, and the Khilafah of Uthman, and the Khilafah of Ali radiallahu anh, and the short Khilafah of Al-Hasan, and then the Khilafah of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, and then the Khilafah of his son Yazid, and some of the events and the fighting and the battles that happened and some of the disputes that happened, so that we put them in the right and in the correct version, so that we can learn how they happened in the correct version of events. From the greatest lies that was ever fabricated is this fabrication that there was some enmity among the Ashab al-Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and that they used to hate one another, or that they used to plan against one another. This is absolutely not correct. And we talked about that, by the way, in those series of lectures that I gave here in this masjid many years ago. And I also gave it again at Masjid MSI, 2 years or 3 years ago or something like that, where we talked about Al al-Bayt, and we talked about the Sahaba, and then we talked about the relationship among them. And we gave a lot of evidences that show that this is, it couldn't be farther from truth, that there was any enmity or some hatred, or there was some ill feeling among them, either from Al al-Bayt toward the Sahaba or Sahaba toward Al al-Bayt. And we kind of debunked all of these fabrications and lies. And there's no better indication that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala said in Surah Ali Imran, كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر وتؤمنون بالله. You are the best nation produced for mankind. Allah Azza wa Jal made us an example of the best nation to mankind. So who can think that this is what happened among them after we hear this. How can we be the best nation ever produced to mankind, and Allah Azza wa Jal made us as an example, and then we say this is what happened among them? How can that be? And it's just inconceivable. You enjoin what is right and forbid that which is wrong, and believe in Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. So obviously we have a need to know how to read this, the history of this ummah, and to learn where the correct and authentic sources of history that we can take from, so that we don't fall into the traps of those who are on purpose. They try to distort the history of this ummah, and to distort the history of the best generations of this ummah, and those who really preserved this deen, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has praised in many ayat. Many ayat that we already spoke about, right? We commented on a lot of ayat that are from thana Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala upon the-Sahaba. The praise of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala upon Sahabat al-Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. One of the important matters that relate to this is, obviously there are a lot of books of history. And these books of history aren't exactly suitable for the common Muslim to go open them and read through them. And a lot of them do that, by the way. A lot of people do that thinking that they're going back to the sources, but they don't know the methodology of reading history books. Because they don't know how those authors, when they authored those books, what was their methodology to do that. We know that al-ahadith in Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we spoke about that when al-muhaddithin, when they collected those ahadith, they put conditions, and they came up with this science of ilm al-rijal, the biography of the man. Those are the narrators in the chain of narrations. For example, one of the best books, and there are others, but one of the best books in this regard is Siyar A'lam al-Nubala. Siyar A'lam al-Nubala. So we know, for example, who each person in the chain of narration who narrated that hadith, so that we are capable of grading or judging the hadith, right? The narration. We need to do the same thing with respect to the history. The history is no different, and we should do the same thing so that we can actually tell if the details of this event is correct or not as it was narrated. This was what allows us to actually tell. We need to look into sanad of this riwayah, of this narration or of this story, so that we can tell. But the problem is, in a lot of instances, there in the sanad of those narrations, there are people who we have no idea who they are. We have no biographies for them. Or we have biographies, but that the people or the scholars and the people of knowledge have not made a judgment of whether they are worthy, or whether they are people who are trustworthy or not. Whether they are thiqat, they are people who we can take from them. We know that they are trustworthy, right? Or whether they are liars. And this is what we call ilm al-jarh wa al-ta'dil. This is by which we are able to judge and tell this is somebody who tells the truth, and we can take from them. Or whether they are some people who are blameworthy and they are liars and we shouldn't take from them. The books of history, and this is what a lot of people don't know, are written different than the books of al-ahadith. Al-ahadith, for example, when you open the book, for example, Sahih al-Bukhari, you can have all the confidence that all of the ahadith are sihah. And Imam al-Bukhari, he had such stringent conditions, who to accept from and who not. Very strong conditions, right? Very strict. And he puts all the sanad, all the chain of narrations. The books of history are different. They don't treat the scholars of history, they don't actually treat history like al-ahadith. What their interest was that they actually always collect all of that they heard. All the stories that came to their attention and everything that was narrated to them, they included it in their books. But they put the sanad of those who narrated these stories. By doing so, they thought, and correctly so, that they actually cleared themselves. They didn't want to lose anything or something get lost. So they included everything in the books of history, because this is not a hadith. We're not, in general, you're not building a hukum based on that. Hadith is a different matter, obviously, because there are rulings, there are, ibadat, there are ahkam from Sharia that can be built upon the hadith. So you have to have the utmost confidence in the hadith. The books of history is a little different. So that's why they included everything that came to their attention. And most of them, if not all of them, they put the sanad of every riwayah, of every narration. And with that, they thought correctly that they cleared themselves with respect, because anybody who reads it, should look into the sanad and see who the narrators of that story is or are, and whether they are authentic or whether they are trustworthy and can be believed, can be trusted or not. Now, obviously, like I said, not everybody knows that. So a lot of people, and by the way, I had an interesting encounter with one of those who knows a lot more than he actually does. I was once in a masjid and I spoke about some of the virtues of Amir al-Mu'mineen Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. So the brother, may Allah guide him, he's an uncle, may Allah guide him, he got so angry. He's like, how can you talk about Amir al-Mu'mineen? Why are you praising? Don't you know what he did? And he started talking left and right. And he's like, I read authentic books of tarikh and history and whatnot, and I read it in their entirety. I'm like, uncle, do you know how to read the book of history? He's like, yeah. I said, did you believe everything in them? He said, yes. I said, but this is not what their intention was. And all of them, including Imam al-Tabari, although he is one of the most authentic scholars and one of the best authors of history among all the scholars, and yet he said, he included in his book that, I am including a lot of things that I'm leaving out there, and I have the sanad of those stories. You look into them and you see if those men can be trusted or not. So in other words, it doesn't mean that if it is in a book of history of some of the famous scholars, then everything can be taken. This is not what they meant. This is not what they meant. And they actually already spoke about that and they mentioned it in their book. And this is the methodology of Imam al-Tabari in his books of history. And he actually said it in his introduction, in the introduction of the book. He said, وَلِيَعْلَمْ النَّاظِرْ فِي كِتَابِنَا هَذَا أَنَّ اعْتِمَادِي فِي كُلِّ مَا أَحْضَرْتُ ذِكْرَهُ فِيهِ مِمَّا شَرَطْتُ أَنِّي رَاسِمُهُ فِيهِ. And let everybody who looks into my book, that whatever I included in the book is from what has been narrated to me. إنما هو ما رويت من الأخبار التي أنا ذاكرها فيه, is from what was narrated to me from the stories, and that I am including in it. والآثار التي أنا مسندها إلى رواتها, and from the stories that I am attributing to their narrators, and I put the full chain of narrators. فما يكن في كتاب هذا من خبر ذكرناه عن بعض الماضين. So whatever is in my book from the news and the reports that I mentioned from those who came before, مما يستنكره القارئ, from those, from what some of the readers may actually think that, wait a minute, this cannot be true. أو يستشنعه سامعه من أجل أنه لم يعرف له وجها في الصحة, or some may find hard to believe because there's it just doesn't feel that it's correct. There's no way that it can be correct. فليعلم أنه لم يؤت في ذلك من قبلنا وإنما أوتي من قبل بعض ناقليه. let him know that this is not what I am saying is correct, but this is what I heard from others. إنما أدينا ذلك على نحو ما أدي إلينا, and we included it in our book exactly the same way as it was narrated to me, as I heard it. And I put, and this is في مقدمة تاريخ الطبري. Imam al-Tabari is a great scholar. So Imam al-Tabari, he put right in the introduction what his methodology are, or is. And then so that the reader knows exactly how to read the book, right? And what he included in it. And that there is some homework for the reader that he needs to do. So Imam al-Tabari here, he didn't say, and he didn't commit, in other words, the summary of this, he didn't commit in his book that he only is selectively including that which is truth and trusted. He's saying, I included everything in my book. And then you study into the al-asanid, and you see that which one is correct or not. So obviously not a lot of people know that, and they read in the book, and then they take everything for granted. And there are catastrophes in these stories. Some of them are just plain outright lies and fabrications. There are a lot of people who are well known to be fabricators, full stop. But Imam al-Tabari and many others, A'imma of al-Tarikh, they actually put them in their books, but they cleared themselves by including the chain of narrators. So that you look into that and you do your homework and you tell if it is to be trusted or not. And some of the scholars, they said that this methodology, Imam Ibn Hajar, as a matter of fact, Imam Ibn Hajar, he actually said that a lot, if not most of those are the early scholars, this was their methodology. ساق الحديث بإسناده, they actually include in their books the stories with their asanid. اعتقدوا أنهم تبرأوا من عهدته. They think when they did this, they thought when they included the chain of narrators that they cleared themselves. They cleared themselves. And so that is why reading the books of history is not as straightforward, or is not as easy as it may look to somebody who is a newcomer. You say, I want to read them on my own and I understand, and they get into the books and they take everything. This is a big mistake. This is a big mistake. Like I said, because the scholars, they differentiated between al-ahadith and al-akhbar, التاريخ, or the history. Like I said, because there is a major difference between al-ahadith that are the basis of al-ahkam in the deen, that you have to have the utmost confidence in them, and between the history, which typically you don't build rulings upon them. So that's why they were a little bit lenient in what they narrated, but they included the chain of narrators. And then you study those chain and see if they are trusted, if all of them are trusted. And that is why it is an important task that we actually filter what's in the books of history and make it easy for the people to teach the people what is correct and what is accurate and what is not. And this is in my hope in this track, inshallah, over the period of weeks and months to come. My hope is, inshallah, that we're going to cover this period of time and cover the events of them, because there are a lot of events. Some of them are pretty serious events of some of the disputes and some of the disagreements that happened even among the Sahaba. But we're going to shed the light upon exactly how that happened and the context of each one of those events and what each one of them were thinking. Unlike somehow people, obviously intentionally they distort and they put it in a way that shed it in a negative way. That is not the case. That is not the case. And sometimes they accuse people, for example, especially the subhanallah, Amir al-Mu'mineen Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan takes the most of the blame, the most of the lies are directed at him for some reason or another, and we're going to talk about some of that, why he in particular, right? But he takes a lot of those, a lot of lies are directed at him. When he radiallahu an, obviously he is also one of the great Sahaba, and we're gonna actually learn about some of the virtues, manaqib Amir al-Mu'mineen Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. And the Muslim is a fair person. The Muslim is fair and just. We don't go by emotions, and if I feel strongly about something, that doesn't make me judge people unjustly. We don't let the emotions get the best of us, and we don't let them make us mistakenly and unjustly judge people. Some of the important sources that we're going to use in this class, if you wish, or track, there is a book called البداية والنهاية للإمام الحافظ famous ابن كثير صاحب تفسير القرآن العظيم, one of the great scholars of Islam, Ibn Kathir. He has a book called البداية والنهاية, the beginning and the end. This is an important book, one of the trusted books. Again, that doesn't mean if it is a trusted book then everything in it is you just take it on its face value. Like I said, they included the chain of narrators so that everybody can make their judgment. Al-Hafiz al-Dhahabi, likewise, another great scholar of Islam, he has a book called Tarikh al-Islam, History of Islam. Also another great and important resource, another important book and resource. There is also Al-Allama Abi Bakr ibn al-Arabi, rahimahullah ta'ala. There is also a book called Al-Awasim min al-Qawasim. This is also another beneficial book of history. طيب. نعم. Actually, I didn't prepare slides for this the particular class because I didn't think that we're going to need them. But if you want, you could either listen to the stream again in here, or if you want, I can. Do you have a piece of paper and pen? I don't know if you have something to write on. I can read them again for you. So there is Kitab al-Bidaya wal-Nihaya by Ibn Kathir, Al-Hafiz Ibn Kathir. There is Tarikh al-Islam, History of Islam by Al-Hafiz al-Dhahabi. And there is العواصم من القواسم للعلامة أبي بكر ابن العربي رحمه الله تعالى رحم الله الجميع. So these are some of the books. That doesn't mean that these are the only books that are out there, but these are some of the major and one of the most trustworthy books out there. One of the, or some of the ways, because we talked about some people fabricating stories and lying and making lies about the events of the Islamic history. What are some of the ways that we should always be very careful about that they did to distort the history of Islam? One of their ways is to literally outright fabricate and lie. There are a lot of akadhib. There are a lot, they fabricate an entire story, an entire event, and they say this is what happened. Like, for example, what they fabricated against al-Mu'mineen Aisha radiyallahu anha when the news of the passing away of Ali ibn Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu, that she prostrated to Allah Azza wa Jal out of gratefulness. Meaning that she was so happy that Ali ibn Abi Talib passed away. This has absolutely no even hint of truth. Completely outright fabricated. But why did they do that? Because again, that serves their purpose. They want to show and they want to again establish that, al-Mu'mineen Aisha used to hate Ali ibn Abi Talib. So they said when she learned about his passing away, she was so happy that she prostrated out of shukran lillah. Imagine. That's one of their ways. Another way, for example, of their lying is that they come to a story or event that did happen, right? And they start to add to it, right? Or they take away from it so that they change the context of it. So they add, they say, the way of expression, right? They pepper on it. They add salt to it. So they manipulate the story, right? They add something to look it like as if it is a different, to distort the way it happened. Another way of what they do is to actually interpret an event in a wrong way. They call it ta'wil. They say, oh, this is what this event happened, and this is what it meant, right? Or this is the meaning of this event, or those series of events. And obviously, they put it in a wrong way, completely wrong. Another way of their ways is to actually only focus on the negatives. So, for example, they come upon a true story, right? Where, for example, there was a mistake by one of Sahaba or group of Sahaba. Well, we said from the very beginning, we don't think that anyone is masum. Now, we're not saying that they don't make mistakes. They do make mistakes, but their mistakes are so minimal and so small that compared to their hasanat and virtues, they pale and they are nothing compared to their virtues. So it's nothing, right? So they actually come and only focus on the negatives, and they make a picture that looks so dark. That's another way of doing it. So this is what they also do. Another of their ways is to actually persuade and try to affect people by, for example, making poems that narrate certain stories, and they take it as a proof that, oh, see, this is what happened. This is no proof. Since when, like, piece of poetry or something that you guys fabricated and put whatever you want in it, and now you're claiming that this is a evidence. It's not an evidence. And it's only the only purpose of that is to actually attack and blame the Sahaba, or to distort some of the events. Poems. Another way of their deviant ways is that they actually write books or letters. They fabricate them and they attribute them to, for example, certain of the Sahaba. They say, for example, such and such from a Sahaba, look at what he wrote. And he is completely innocent from that. So again, they try to lie on people and try to convince them that this is a letter or this is something that such and such Sahabi wrote. And it is completely wrong. Another, and this is one of the meanest, Allahu Akbar, one of the meanest ways that they try to distort history is by playing on the similarity of the names. Check this out. What does that mean? So they come, for example, and there are two people who have similar names, very similar names. Now, obviously, the ones who are not very knowledgeable, they won't be able to notice the difference, right? So they think when you mention a name that it is actually the other person. And so they actually try to provide evidence and proof, then say, well, such and such a scholar, he said this, and you think this is the famous scholar. So, for example, Ibn Jarir al-Tabari, this is a famous Imam, Sahib al-Tafsir. Tafsir al-Tabari is one of the best tafsir out there. Imam min a'immat Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Imam Ibn Jarir al-Tabari. But there are two names, two who are called Ibn Jarir. The first one is Muhammad ibn Jarir ibn Yazid ibn Ja'far al-Tabari. This is al-Imam al-Thiqa, Imam min a'immat Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. But there is another person called Muhammad ibn Jarir ibn Rustum Abu Ja'far al-Tabari. This is from A'immat al-Shia. So they may come and say, well, قال الإمام Ibn Jarir such and such. So the ignorant, what do they think? Oh, Ibn Jarir al-Tabari. But this is not Ibn Jarir al-Tabari that we know about. So they play on the similarity of the names to trick people into thinking that it is al-Imam. So they attribute a book or they attribute, certain argumentation that this is what Imam Ibn Jarir said. And you think that it is Ibn Jarir al-Tabari. Another one, for example, this is another interesting one. Ibn Hajar, the famous Imam, right? Al-Hafiz Ibn Hajar, well known, big Imam, right? A'immat Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. But there are two who have similar names. There is Ahmad ibn Ali ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. This is Imam min A'immat al-Hadith. Imam min A'immat al-Hadith. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, well known. But there is another one, Ahmad ibn Hajar al-Haytami, Imam fil fiqh. He is an Imam in fiqh, but he has nothing to do with al-Hadith. So they may come and say, well, Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, he corrected this hadith. He has nothing to do with al-Hadith. He's not from the scholars of al-Hadith. This is not al-Imam Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani that we know is from al-Hadith. So to say that he corrected this hadith is not correct. So this is all ways that they actually play tricks upon people to trick them and to distort the events and to play along and distort the history for various reasons. And this is why there's now, after all of this discussion, we should actually appreciate the importance of التثبت, to actually make sure that these sources are trustworthy or not. Is this story correct? Is it accurate? Is it something that we can rely upon? And this is what Allah Azza wa Jal guided us to in Surah Al-Hujurat. Allah Azza wa Jal gave us a very important basic principle, which is to say what? Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِن جَاءَكُمْ فَاسِقٌ بِنَبَإٍ فَتَبَيَّنُوا أن تصيبوا قوما بجهالة فتصبحوا على ما فعلتم نادمين. If a fasiq comes and tells you such something, he brings a news to you or a report to you, what are we supposed to do? Take it and then keep spreading it? He's a fasiq. How can we believe him? So what we're supposed to do, يا أيها الذين آمنوا, this is guidance from Allah Azza wa Jal. إن جاءكم فاسق بنبأ, if a fasiq, a liar, a fabricator, an evildoer came to you and told you something, then go فَتَثَبَّتُوا, then make sure. Then you're supposed to go back to the sources and make sure that what he told you is accurate. أَن تُصِيبُوا قَوْمًا بِجَهَالَةٍ, otherwise you may actually unjustly blame or harm, wrong other people unjustly based on false reports. So this is guidance from Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala and shows us that it is of utmost importance, التثبت, to actually make sure of the news and the reports that comes to us. I want to stop inshallah here because next we're going to jump right into the beginning of the events of how Abu Bakr as-Siddiq was elected or agreed upon per se, and he was he was given the pledge of allegiance and elected as Khalifatu Rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And obviously we have no enough time to even start this discussion. So inshallah we'll start next week bi'idhnillah tabaraka wa ta'ala. And if there are any questions or concerns or additions, inshallah. Even from online, I don't know if there is any person who has any question or comments, inshallah, in the next 5 minutes.
Just to animate this halaqa, inshallah. Not a scholar or anything, just to contribute, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Reading the books of history, it's a two-way street. It's what's your bughya, what's your goal from reading that book, and also who's that person, the author, that writing that book. Because if the two collide, then you may not achieve the goal that you're trying to get to, which is understanding the history of our nation, right?
No.
Tarikh al-Ummah.
No. And that is why if you, I'm sorry, go ahead, sorry. Yeah. No, go ahead.
No, you go.
طيب. So the brother is talking about يعني we're supposed to know how to read the books of history and what is the goal of reading the book of history, right? Because it is beneficial. It is our history. It is the history of our nation. And so this is exactly what we've been saying from the beginning. So it is very important in the first place to know what books to read in. And if you start reading in a book that you know the author of this book is a complete fabricator, what's the point? Don't do that. Don't start reading into a book that is well known to have a specific goal, a specific purpose that he's trying to project upon people. Start with the books of trusted scholars. That's one. Second, when you read that, you need to be aware of the methodology of the author. You need to understand what you're getting into so that you don't fall into into mistakes. You need to know that this is a book of history, not a book of ahadith. So all the authors of the books of history, the well-known ones, they said from the beginning in their introduction that we're not committing to only include in the book that which is trusted. Anything that came to us, we included it as it came to us. Some of them may not be accurate. Some of them may be complete fabrications or may have some additions. But they included the chain of narrators, those who narrated it to them. They included it with the story, with the report. And they said, now we've relieved ourselves, we freed ourselves and cleared our conscience and our responsibility toward the ummah by including this chain of narrators of the story. Now you look and study these men, rijal, in the chain of narration. Are they trustworthy? Are they people who we can believe, or are they known to be liars? Like we do for al-hadith, right? We study, how do we tell that the hadith is correct? By looking at in the matan, in the actual hadith, and as well as the chain of narrators. Rijal, right? Ruwa. Likewise, we do the same thing in there. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to tell if this is correct or not. So, two things. You should always start with a book from a well-known scholar. Second, you need to understand that not necessarily everything that they included in their book is correct, per se. You have to do your homework, and this is why it is a little bit tricky to do it yourself. I don't advise anyone in general like that, somebody who doesn't necessarily have knowledge or that tools to be able to tell, to just open a book of history and read it on your own. Don't do that. And that is why I decided to actually have this class, because I'm hoping that, because this is a period of time that a lot of inaccuracies in the minds of people or in their knowledge. So they say, I heard about this, or I thought this is what happened. So there are a lot of inaccuracies, and we're trying to actually clear those inaccuracies and filter them out and tell the story as it happened, like it happened. This is an important part of our history. So we want to straighten the record, if you wish, right? Ride the ship and straighten the record and say this is based on the true evidences and true narrators and correct sources, trusted sources. This is what happened. And again, just to emphasize, we're not claiming isma to anyone. We're not claiming al-isma to any individual person. We're not saying anyone was infallible. Yes, they made mistakes. Some of them they made mistakes. And sometimes the Sahaba split, for example. One group against another group, and they had difference of opinion. They thought, some group, for example, they thought al-haq is with this side. Others, they said, no, al-haq is with the other side. Right? Not right? طيب. So obviously one of them was wrong, and one side was correct. So we're going to say whose was on the true side and who was wrong. But we still believe that their hasanat were overwhelmingly is much bigger than the mistakes, and they did it on with good intention. They did ijtihad. It's not like this is their desires, but they did ijtihad too and thought that this is what is haqq, and they did what they believed was al-haqq. But they were mistaken. So inshallah, I don't want to take much longer. بإذن الله تبارك وتعالى, will continue next week. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the tawfiq to learn and put into practice. And mashallah, the two topics, alhamdulillah, I hope that you value those two topics, ta'zeem al-ilm and this history, inshallah, from our Islamic history. أسأل الله لي ولكم العلم النافع والعمل الصالح والإخلاص في القول والعمل. هذا والله أعلم، وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.